The gunshot that ripped through the Arizona territory that afternoon wasn't the sound that froze Rebecca Mayfield to her soul. It was the silence that followed, a dead, watchful quiet that promised more violence to come. In a world carved by brutality, where the lines between justice and vengeance were blurred by dust and blood, a lone woman on an isolated homestead would be forced to make a choice. Not with a rifle, but with her own body. This is the story of that choice, a decision that would pit her against her own people, earn her the hatred of a ruthless cattle baron, and forge an unbreakable bond with a wounded Apache warrior. It's the story of how one act of impossible courage earned her a name that would be whispered across the plains for generations, Mother of Peace. The land around the Dragoon Mountains was the Devil's Anvil, a place where the sun hammered down with relentless fury, forging the rock and the people into something hard and unforgiving. Rebecca Mayfield knew its cruelty intimately. It had taken her husband Thomas 3 years prior, not a bullet or an arrow, but a fever that burned through him as mercilessly as a brush fire. It had left her with nothing but 160 acres of stubborn soil, a sturdy cabin built with her own hands alongside his, and a silence that was often louder than the wind. At 32, Rebecca was a woman whittled down to her essential elements. Her hair, the color of sun-bleached wheat, was perpetually tied back in a severe bun. Her face was a map of her life, faint lines around her eyes, from squinting into the sun, a firm set to her jaw that spoke of resolved hardship. She was not beautiful in the way of the soft-skinned women back east, but she possessed a stark, resilient grace like a desert yucca that bloomed against all odds. The year was 1882, and the air in the Arizona territory was thick with more than just dust. It was choked with a suffocating hatred between the settlers and the Chiricahua Apache. General Crook's campaigns had pushed many of the tribes onto the reservations at San Carlos, a place they called Hell's 40 Acres. But not all had gone. Bands led by tenacious chiefs like Geronimo and the quieter, more strategic Nana still considered these mountains their sacred home, their Bai-Hay Sea, and they fought for it with a desperation that the settlers called savagery. Rebecca existed in the precarious space between these two warring worlds. She feared the Apache as everyone did. She had heard the chilling tales of raids of families slaughtered and ranches burned. But unlike many of her neighbors, she didn't possess the blind, all-consuming hatred that seemed to be a prerequisite for survival. She saw the desperation in the land itself, the way the creeks ran dry, and the game grew scarce. She understood in a way she couldn't articulate that the violence was a symptom of a deeper wound, a wound in the earth itself. The day it all began, the sky was the color of a bruised plum. A freak summer storm was brewing the air heavy and electric. Rebecca was mending a harness on her porch, the familiar scent of leather and linseed oil. A small comfort when she first heard the distant crack of rifles. It wasn't the measured sound of a hunter. This was frantic, chaotic a firefight. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She scanned the horizon, her eyes tracing the jagged spine of the mountains. Then she saw them. A small group of riders, a posse cutting across the chaparral 2 miles distant. They were chasing something. A moment later, a lone figure on horseback broke from a cluster of mesquite, heading directly toward her homestead. An Apache. He rode low and fast, a fleeting silhouette against the darkening sky. But something was wrong. He swayed in the saddle, his movements erratic. The posse, a pack of wolves sensing a kill, gained ground. Rebecca's first instinct was pure, unadulterated fear. She scrambled inside her hands, reaching for the Winchester rifle Thomas had taught her to use. It was loaded. It was always loaded. She rested its heavy barrel on the windowsill, her knuckles white. The unwritten law of the frontier was simple: you shoot first, you survive. An Apache warrior riding onto your land meant one thing and one thing only. But as he drew closer, the scenario her mind had rehearsed 1,000 times began to unravel. He wasn't charging her cabin with a war cry. He was fleeing. She could see now that his left arm hung uselessly, and a dark stain was spreading across his deerskin shirt, stark against his coppery skin. As he galloped past a stand of ocotillo, a puff of dust erupted from the ground near his horse's hooves. Another shot from the posse. The horse screamed, stumbled, and went down in a cloud of ochre dust, throwing its rider violently to the ground. The Apache warrior lay still for a moment, then staggered to his feet. He was young, perhaps no older than 20. His face, smeared with dirt and sweat, was a mask of defiant agony. He drew a long knife, his only remaining weapon, and stood his ground, facing the oncoming riders. It was a suicidal gesture, an act of pure, desperate pride. The posse was less than a mile away now. She could make out the leader, a man she knew by reputation and dreaded by sight, Silas Cain. Cain was a cattle baron who had amassed a small empire through methods that were as brutal as the land itself. He was a big man, with a florid face and eyes as cold and pale as a winter sky. He believed the only solution to the Apache problem was extermination, and he pursued this belief with a religious fervor, his posse a congregation of hired guns and resentful ranchers. Rebecca watched her rifle, still aimed, her finger trembling on the trigger. This was it, the moment of truth. She should leave him to his fate. It was his fight, not hers. Helping him would be suicide. Cain would see it as the ultimate betrayal. Her neighbor's men, like Jedediah Smith, who ran the neighboring ranch and had been a friend to Thomas, would turn on her in an instant. She would be an outcast, a pariah, a traitor. But then something inside her shifted. It wasn't a thought, but a feeling, a deep seismic tremor of conscience. She saw not a faceless savage, but a wounded young man cornered and about to be slaughtered for sport. She saw the same defiant pride that had been in Thomas's eyes as he fought the fever, the refusal to surrender to the inevitable. She saw a reflection of her own lonely, stubborn fight against the wilderness. "What are you doing?" a voice screamed in her head. "This is madness!" But another, quieter voice whispered back. "What is the alternative?" To watch a man be torn apart like a rabbit. The posse was getting closer, their triumphant whoops carrying on the wind. The young warrior braced himself, his dark eyes fixed on his approaching death. Rebecca made her choice. It was an act of temporary insanity, a rebellion against the brutal logic of her world. With a strangled sob of fear and resolve, she lowered the Winchester. She threw open her cabin door and ran. She ran not away from the danger, but directly into its path. The warrior saw her coming. His eyes widened in disbelief, his stance faltering. He likely thought she was another attacker coming to finish the job. "Get down!" she screamed, her voice hoarse. "Into the root cellar." She pointed frantically toward the heavy wooden doors set into the ground beside her cabin. It was dark, cool, and the only place on the property Silas Cain wouldn't think to look twice. He stared at her, uncomprehending the chasm of language and hatred between them a mile wide. The posse was just a few hundred yards away now. There was no more time for persuasion. Rebecca didn't hesitate. She grabbed his good arm, her touch surprisingly strong. The shock of contact, the warmth of his skin against hers, sent a jolt through them both. She pulled him, half dragging, half guiding his stumbling form towards the cellar. He was weak from blood loss, his resistance feeble. Please, she begged the word foreign in this context of violence. He seemed to understand the desperation in her tone, if not the words. He allowed her to guide him. She wrenched open the heavy cellar doors. The smell of damp earth and stored potatoes rose to meet them. He hesitated at the edge of the darkness, his warrior's pride warring with the instinct for survival. Now she urged, pushing him toward the ladder. He descended his movements, clumsy with pain. Just as his head disappeared below ground, Rebecca slammed the door shut, threw the thick wooden crossbar into place, and kicked dirt and loose straw over the seams to hide them. She spun around her heart, a wild drum against her ribs, just as Silas Cain and his 5 riders thundered into her yard. Their horses were lathered, their faces flushed with the thrill of the chase. Mayfield Cain boomed his voice a gravelly roar. He reined in his horse, which danced nervously, its eyes wild. He looked down at her from his saddle, a position of dominance he clearly relished. "You see an Injun come through here wounded, riding like the devil himself was on his tail." Rebecca fought to control her breathing, to make her face a placid mask. She pressed a hand to her chest, feigning a startled fear she didn't have to invent. "Mr. Cain, you gave me a fright. I heard shooting. The shooting's the least of your worries if that red devil is hiding on your property." Another rider. A wiry man named Pike with a scarred lip spat. "We winged him good. He can't have gone far." Cain's cold eyes swept the homestead. They took in the cabin, the small corral, with her lone mare, the chicken coop, the tool shed. They lingered for a fraction of a second on the cellar doors covered in the straw she had just scattered. Rebecca's blood ran cold. "He went down right over there," Cain said, pointing with his rifle toward the spot where the horse had fallen. "His horse is dead. He's on foot, and this is the only shelter for a mile in any direction." He dismounted his boots, hitting the ground with an authoritative thud. He walked toward her, his spurs jingling a deathly rhythm. He was even more intimidating up close, a mountain of a man who smelled of sweat, whiskey, and leather. "Now I'll ask you again, Mrs. Mayfield," he said, his voice dropping to a low, menacing purr. "Where is he?" Rebecca drew herself up to her full height, which still felt pitifully small before him. "I saw him go down," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. He got up and ran, headed east toward the rocks. She pointed toward a jumble of granite boulders a half-mile away in the opposite direction of where the warrior was hidden. Cain's eyes narrowed, searching her face for any sign of deception. It was the longest moment of Rebecca's life. The world seemed to shrink to the space between them, to the silent battle of wills being waged in the charged air. Below her feet, she could almost feel the presence of the wounded man, his life hanging on her ability to lie to this monster. Pike spat on the ground again. "He's lying. Check the barn, boys. Check the shed." 2 of the men dismounted and began to ransack her small property, their movements rough and careless. They kicked open the door to the shed, sending her neatly stacked tools scattering. They tramped through her small vegetable garden. Cain never took his eyes off her. "You live out here all alone, Mrs. Mayfield. A woman of your quality. Must get lonely. Dangerous, too. It'd be a shame if your neighbors came to believe you were uncooperative. An Injun sympathizer. The threat was unmistakable, laid bare and ugly. He wasn't just threatening her with violence, but with total ostracization, a death sentence of a different kind on the frontier. One of the men came back from the shed. "Nothing, boss." Cain gestured with his chin toward the cabin. "What about in there? He wouldn't be in my home." Rebecca said, a cold fury rising through her fear. The violation was too much. Cain smiled, a humorless stretching of his lips. "Wouldn't he?" He started walking toward her porch. He was going to go inside. And to get there, he would have to walk directly over the cellar doors. Rebecca's mind raced. Panic seized her. There was only one thing she could do. One desperate, insane gamble. As Cain drew level with the cellar, she stepped directly in his path, placing herself between him and the doors. "Mr. Cain," she said, her voice trembling but firm, "you are not welcome in my house." He stopped, surprised by her audacity. He looked down at her, then at the ground at her feet. For a heart-stopping second, his gaze rested on the cellar doors she was so obviously protecting. A flicker of suspicion crossed his face. "Get out of my way, woman," he growled. "No," she said, planting her feet. She held his gaze, her entire being focused on this single act of defiance. She was shielding the hidden man, not just with a lie, but with her own body. In that moment, the thin fabric of civilization was torn away, and it was just the two of them, the predator and the protector, locked in a primal standoff. The air crackled. The wind whipped strands of hair across her face. Cain stared at her, his mind working. He saw a lone, stubborn woman. A grieving widow, perhaps a little mad from the solitude. Was it possible she was telling the truth? Was her defiance simply the outrage of a private woman whose home was being invaded? Or was it the desperate act of a liar? He seemed to weigh the effort of forcing the issue against the possibility the warrior truly had fled to the rocks. Time was wasting. Finally, with a grunt of disgust, he relented. "Fine," he spat. "Have it your way. But mark my words, Rebecca Mayfield, if I find out you're lying to me, I won't just burn this place to the ground. I'll make sure you're in it." He turned on his heel, his rage a palpable force. "He's in the rocks!" he bellowed to his men. "Let's go! Fan out!" The men mounted their horses, casting venomous glares at Rebecca as they went. They thundered out of her yard, heading east, their bloodlust now directed toward the granite boulders. Rebecca stood frozen, her legs shaking so violently she thought she would collapse. She watched until they were distant figures, swallowed by the vast, indifferent landscape. Only then did she allow herself to breathe. She sagged against the cabin wall, the adrenaline leaving her weak and nauseous. She had done it. She had lied to Silas Cain and lived. But as the first drops of the storm began to fall, spattering the dust at her feet, she knew this was not the end. It was the beginning. Below the ground, in the darkness of her root cellar, lay a wounded Apache warrior, whose life was now inextricably bound to hers. She had shielded him with her body, and in doing so she had just declared war on her own world. The storm broke with the fury of a betrayed god. Rain fell in solid, blinding sheets, turning the hard-packed earth of her yard into a slick, churning morass of mud. The wind howled like a chorus of grieving spirits. For a time, Rebecca remained huddled on the porch, letting the rain lash at the edges of her dress, the raw power of the storm. A strange comfort. It mirrored the tempest in her own soul. When the initial deluge subsided to a steady, relentless drumming on the tin roof, she knew she couldn't wait any longer. Every minute the man spent in the damp, cold cellar risked infection and worsened his condition. Taking a deep breath, she moved to the cellar doors. Her hands, slick with rain, struggled with the heavy crossbar. With a final desperate heave, she slid it free and pulled the doors open. A wave of musty air washed over her. She peered down into the Stygian blackness. "It's safe," she called out, her voice barely a whisper. "They're gone." There was no response. For a terrible moment, she thought he might have died down there. "Hello," she tried again, her voice cracking. A faint groan answered her from the bottom of the ladder. He was alive, lighting a kerosene lantern, its golden glow pushing back the oppressive shadows. She descended the rickety wooden steps. The cellar was small, the walls lined with shelves holding jars of preserves, peaches, beans, tomatoes, the colorful fruits of a summer's labor that now seemed to belong to a different lifetime. He was slumped at the base of the ladder, his back against the earthen wall. In the flickering lamplight, he looked even younger. His face was pale beneath his coppery skin, his lips tinged with blue. His breathing was shallow. The deerskin shirt around his shoulder was completely saturated with blood, the dark stain glistening wetly in the lantern light. He watched her approach, his dark eyes, wary, filled with a mixture of pain and suspicion. His hand rested on the hilt of his knife. He was a cornered animal, ready to fight to his last breath. Rebecca set the lantern down on a crate. She held up her empty hands to show she meant no harm. "I want to help you," she said slowly and clearly, though she knew the words were meaningless to him. It was the tone she hoped he would understand, the universal language of compassion. She knelt a few feet away from him, careful not to make any sudden moves. "Your shoulder," she said, pointing to his wound. "I have to look at it." He didn't move his gaze unwavering. She could see the conflict in his eyes. Every instinct, everything he had ever been taught, screamed that she was the enemy. White people Inda were the source of his people's suffering. They were destroyers, liars. And yet she had saved him. She had faced down the other white men and hidden him. Rebecca knew that trust, if it could be built at all, had to be built on a bridge of actions, not words. She rose slowly and went back up the ladder. She returned minutes later with a basin of warm water, clean cloths, a bottle of carbolic acid, and the tin box that held her medical supplies, needle catgut and bandages. She had learned doctoring out of necessity, tending to Thomas, to her livestock, to herself. She set the items down and knelt before him again. She looked him directly in the eye, her expression pleading. Then, with painstaking slowness, she began to tend to herself. She had scraped her arm on the cellar door in her haste. She dipped a cloth in the warm water, cleaned the small wound with a dab of the stinging acid, and wrapped it with a small piece of linen. She was showing him what she intended to do, demonstrating that the tools were for healing, not harming. He watched her every move, his focus absolute. When she was done, she looked at him again, a silent question in her eyes. After a long, tense silence, he gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. It was a monumental concession. Rebecca let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. Carefully, she moved closer. The smell of blood and rain-soaked leather was strong. With gentle fingers, she began to cut away the sleeve of his shirt. The fabric was stuck to the wound, and he hissed in pain as she worked to free it. "I'm sorry," she whispered the words in instinctual comfort. When she finally exposed the injury, she had to stifle a gasp. The bullet had torn through the thick muscle of his shoulder, exiting cleanly out the back. It was a vicious wound, bleeding sluggishly, but mercifully the bullet wasn't still inside him. That was one blessing. The bigger danger now was infection, the blood poisoning that claimed so many. She worked with quiet efficiency. She cleaned the entry and exit wounds with the carbolic solution, his body tensing at the sharp, burning pain. But he made no other sound. His stoicism was unnerving. She had seen hardened ranchers scream and curse from lesser injuries. He remained silent, his jaw clenched, his eyes squeezed shut. The most difficult part was the stitching. The needle was sharp, but pulling the torn flesh together was a gruesome task. Her hands were steady, her movements precise. As she worked, she talked to him, not expecting him to understand, but to fill the silence with a tone of reassurance. "My Thomas, my husband, he taught me to be steady," she murmured, her thoughts drifting. He'd say, "Rebecca, panic is a luxury we can't afford." He was a good man, quiet, strong. This land, it asks too much of people. She finished the last stitch, tied it off, and applied a thick poultice of comfrey and yarrow herbs she grew for this very purpose. Finally, she wrapped his shoulder and chest tightly with clean bandages. The whole process took nearly an hour. By the end, they were both exhausted, bathed in the humid warmth of the cellar. He leaned his head back against the wall, his eyes closed. The immediate agony had subsided into a deep, throbbing ache. Rebecca cleaned her tools, her movements slow and weary. The reality of her situation was beginning to sink in. She had an enemy warrior, a Chiricahua Apache in her cellar. She was harboring a fugitive from Silas Cain, the most powerful and ruthless man in the region. "You need to rest," she said, more to herself than to him. "And you must be hungry." She brought him a bowl of lukewarm stew from the night before and a cup of water. He ate ravenously, his one good hand clumsy but effective. They sat in silence, the only sounds the dripping of water outside and his rough swallows. A fragile, unspoken truce existed between them in the lantern's glow. For 3 days the storm raged, trapping them together. The homestead was an island in a sea of mud. No one could get in, and no one could get out. It was a strange, suspended reality. By day, Rebecca would go about her chores in the cabin above her senses on high alert, listening for any sound of approaching riders. At night, and several times during the day, she would descend into the cellar to tend to him. She changed his bandages, cleaned the wound, and fed him. The fever she had dreaded set in on the 2nd day. He became delirious, his body slick with sweat. He thrashed and mumbled in his own tongue, the words guttural and strange to her ears. In his delirium, he cried out a name, Nana, over and over. During those fevered hours, Rebecca did not leave his side. She bathed his face with cool water, forced sips of willow bark tea between his cracked lips, and held him steady when the shivers took him. In his vulnerability, the lines that divided them, race culture, conflict, seemed to fade away. He was no longer an Apache warrior or an enemy. He was just a young man, grievously wounded and fighting for his life, and she was the only one there to help him. On the 4th day, the fever broke. He woke in the late afternoon, his mind clear for the first time in days. He found her asleep in a chair she had dragged down into the cellar, her head slumped against the wall. The lantern had burned low, casting long, dancing shadows. He watched her for a long time, this strange white woman who had tended to him with such care. He saw the exhaustion etched on her face, the dark circles under her eyes. When she finally stirred and opened her eyes, she found him looking at her. His gaze no longer filled with suspicion, but with a profound and quiet intensity. "The fever is gone," she said, her voice raspy with sleep. He nodded. He pushed himself up, his movements stiff. He looked at his bandaged shoulder, then back at her. He touched his own chest, and for the first time he spoke a word she could understand, his voice rough from disuse. "Kael," he said. It took her a moment to realize he was telling her his name. "Kael," she repeated softly. She then touched her own chest. Rebecca. A name. It was the first plank in the bridge of silence. In the days that followed, as the sun came out and began to bake the mud hard again, their strange cohabitation continued. The immediate danger of the posse had passed, but Rebecca knew Cain was not a man to forget. Her neighbor Jedediah would surely ride over to check on her as soon as the roads were passable. The secret of Kael's presence was a ticking bomb. They began to communicate through a clumsy mixture of gestures and single words. He pointed to the jars on her shelves, and she would name them. Peach. Bean. He in turn would give her the Apache word. Du-te-e. Nu-te-e. He taught her the Apache word for water tu and for sun sha. She taught him the English words. She learned that his father was a respected leader, and the name he had cried out in his fever, Nana, was his father's name. This information sent a chill down her spine. This wasn't just any warrior. This was the son of a chief. The stakes of her actions had just risen exponentially. He learned about her. He would watch her as she worked her hands mending a shirt or kneading dough. He saw the sadness that sometimes clouded her eyes, the deep well of loneliness she tried to hide. One day, he picked up a small piece of scrap wood, and using his long knife with his good hand, he began to carve. The day Jedediah Smith finally arrived felt inevitable. Rebecca saw his wagon approaching from a mile away, her stomach twisting into a cold knot. Jedediah was a decent man, gaunt and weathered with kind eyes that had seen too much sorrow. He had been Thomas's best friend, and he looked out for Rebecca with a gruff, brotherly concern. But he was also a man of his time and place. He had lost family in an Apache raid years ago. His hatred, while quieter than Cain's, was just as deep. Kael, Rebecca said, rushing to the cellar. "Someone is coming. You must be silent. Do not make a sound." He understood immediately. His expression became a stoic mask as she secured the cellar doors and scattered straw over them once more. Rebecca Jedediah called out as he pulled his wagon to a halt. "Lord Almighty woman, I was worried sick. That was some storm. Figured I'd come check you hadn't floated away." "Jedediah," she said, forcing a smile. "I'm fine. The cabin is sturdy." His eyes scanned the yard, saw Silas Cain and his boys the other day, riding like madmen. Said they were hunting some renegade who came this way. "You didn't see anything, did you?" The direct question felt like a physical blow. I saw them," she said, choosing her words carefully. They were gone before the worst of the rain hit. Jedediah nodded, but his gaze was sharp. He noticed things. He saw the extra plate on her drying rack. He saw the faint telltale tracks of a man's boots, larger than hers, leading from the cabin to the wood-piled tracks she had failed to erase in the still damp earth. His eyes narrowed slightly. "You have enough supplies?" he asked, his tone shifting. "I brought you some flour and salt pork." "Thank you, Jed, but I'm all right." He didn't press her. He unloaded the supplies anyway, his movements stiff. The easy camaraderie between them was gone, replaced by a tense, unspoken suspicion. He looked toward the cellar doors, a frown creasing his brow. "Something wrong with your cellar?" he asked casually. "No." Why, Rebecca's heart pounded. Looks like you've barred it from the outside." "That's new." She swallowed hard. The wind. It was rattling the doors something fierce. "I just secured them." It was a flimsy lie, and they both knew it. Jedediah looked at her for a long, hard moment, his kind eyes filled with a new, troubled expression. It was a look of deep disappointment and dawning horror. He knew. He didn't know the specifics, but he knew she was hiding something or someone. Without another word, he climbed back into his wagon. "Be careful, Rebecca," he said, his voice heavy with meaning. "There are lines you don't cross out here, not if you want to survive." He drove away, leaving Rebecca standing in a cloud of dust and dread. The secret was out. Maybe not to Cain, not yet, but it was out. She had not only broken the law of the territory, she had broken the trust of the only friend she had left. The bridge of silence she had built with Cain in the safety of her cellar had come at a cost, the complete and utter destruction of the bridges to her own world. That night, Cain knew he had to leave. Her friend's visit had changed the air. The danger for her was no longer a possibility. It was a certainty. His shoulder was healing, still weak, but he was strong enough to travel. He found her by the hearth, staring into the flames. He stood before her, and she looked up, her eyes full of a weary sorrow. He held out the piece of wood he had been carving. It was a small, intricately carved bird, a hawk, its wings outstretched in flight. It was a thing of simple, profound beauty. A gift, a thank you, a farewell. She took it, her fingers tracing the smooth lines of the wood. "You're leaving," she said. It wasn't a question. He nodded. "Rebecca," he said, his pronunciation of her name still careful and deliberate. He pointed to his chest. "Cain." Then he pointed to her and said a word in his own language, a word she had never heard before. "Shidine e." My people. He then tapped his chest again and pointed to her, repeating the same gesture. He was telling her that they were in some way the same. Connected. Tears welled in Rebecca's eyes. She nodded, understanding his meaning perfectly. Under the cover of a moonless night, she walked with him to the edge of her property. He was just a shadow in the darkness, his form blending with the landscape he belonged to. He turned to her one last time, his dark eyes meeting hers. There were 1,000 things to say, none of which they had the words for. He raised a hand in a gesture of farewell, then melted into the night, heading back toward the mountains. Rebecca stood there for a long time, clutching the small wooden hawk in her hand. The silence that returned was different from the one Thomas had left behind. It was heavier, more profound. It was the silence of a choice, made a line crossed, and the terrifying unknown consequences that were surely coming for her with the morning sun. The silence Cain left behind was a living entity, heavy and profound. The small wooden hawk he had carved became Rebecca's rosary, its smooth surface a constant reminder of the secret she kept. But the world outside her homestead had no patience for silence. It demanded an accounting, and Jedediah's suspicion had planted a virulent seed. The unraveling began within a week. When she rode into the small settlement of Tres Piedras for supplies, the change was palpable. The usual friendly greetings were replaced with clipped words and averted eyes. Martha, the storekeeper's wife, busied herself stacking tins, refusing to meet Rebecca's gaze. The whispers followed her like a shadow. Cain's men were sniffing around her place. "Jed Smith says she's acting strange." They didn't know the truth, But in a world of stark loyalties, ambiguity was a disease, and Rebecca Mayfield had become its carrier. Silas Cain was the architect of her isolation, patiently poisoning the well. His ranch hands spread rumors in the saloon, painting her as a squaw lover who had lost her senses, a danger to the entire community. The first overt act of hostility was a dead coyote hung from her gatepost, a crude sign nailed beneath it in dripping tar, "Indian lover." Fear, cold and sharp, pierced her solitude. This was a direct warning. She buried the animal, the act feeling like a funeral for her own safety. She knew she had to face the source of the rumors. She rode to Jedediah's ranch, the wooden hawk tucked in her pocket. She found him repairing a fence line, his back to her. "Jedediah," she called out, her voice tight. He turned slowly. The kindness in his eyes had been replaced by a hard, weary caution. "Rebecca, you know what they're saying," she said, dispensing with pleasantries. "You know what they're doing. That coyote, I heard he said not stopping his work. People are scared. Cain's been stirring them up. And you... Are you scared of me, Jed?" He finally stopped and faced her, his expression a mask of internal conflict. "I don't know what to think." "You lied to my face, Rebecca. I saw the signs. You were hiding him, weren't you, an Apache?" The accusation, stark and undeniable, hung between them. The lie was pointless now. "He was wounded," she said softly. "Cain's posse was going to murder him. He was just a boy." He was Apache. Jedediah's voice cracked with a sudden raw pain. "Do you forget what they did to my brother's family? A boy with a knife is still deadly. They are not like us." "That's not true," she retorted. I saw the pain in his eyes. I saw gratitude. "He is a man, Jedediah, same as you were to Thomas." The mention of her husband's name was a low blow. Jedediah flinched. "Thomas would have never done what you did. He knew the way of this land. You've let the loneliness twist you." His voice lowered, filled with a grim finality. "Cain's man, Pike, he cornered me in town, asked me what I saw. I didn't tell him not the truth. But they're watching you. And now they're watching me for even talking to you. You've put us all in danger." She understood then. He wasn't just angry. He was terrified. Cain was squeezing the entire community, and she was the focal point of the pressure. "So you'll do nothing?" she asked, her voice hollow. "There's nothing I can do," he said, turning his back on her for good. "You made your choice. Now you have to live with it." Rebecca rode home, a profound desolation washing over her. She was truly alone, an island of one in a hostile sea. The days that followed were a slow descent into a siege. She stopped going to the settlement. Her supplies dwindled. She took to carrying the Winchester everywhere, and the nights were an agony of vigilance, every gust of wind a potential footstep. One evening, as dusk bled across the sky, she saw movement at the edge of her property. Her heart leaped into her throat as she grabbed the rifle. It wasn't Cain's men. It was 3 figures on foot emerging from the chaparral. They were Apache. Her blood ran cold, but they weren't moving like a war party. They moved slowly, their hands empty and held open. One was older, his hair streaked with grey, his face a web of deep lines. The second was a younger man she didn't recognize. The third was Kyle. He was thinner, his arm still in a sling, but it was him. He stopped at a distance, his presence a silent question. The old man who she knew must be his father, Nana, fixed his gaze on her cabin. This was a test, a communication. Rebecca's instinct, the same one that had told her to save Cain, urged her to respond in kind. Slowly, she laid her rifle on the table. She opened her door and stepped onto the porch, her own hands held open at her sides. The old man watched her for a long moment, then spoke to Cain. Cain nodded, and the chief stepped forward. He was carrying a bundle wrapped in deerskin. With great ceremony, he laid it on the ground. Then Cain and the other warrior retreated, melting back into the shadows as silently as they had arrived. Rebecca waited, her heart hammering before approaching. With trembling fingers, she unwrapped the bundle. Inside lay a butchered quarter of a deer, fresh and clean. Beside it were piñon nuts and a string of medicinal herbs. It was a gift, a payment, an acknowledgement of the debt. They knew she was an outcast, and they had come not to harm her, but to provide. Tears streamed down her face as she carried the life-saving food back to her cabin. She had been cast out by one world only to be cautiously embraced by another. But the act had been witnessed. High on a ridge overlooking her homestead, Silas Cain lowered his spyglass, a cruel, triumphant smile spreading across his face. Pike stood beside him, cradling a rifle. "Well, well," Cain said, his voice a low, satisfied rumble. "Look at that pike. A regular family reunion. It's the proof we needed." He had been patient, letting the pressure build. He knew the Apache wouldn't forget. He had been watching her homestead, waiting for this very moment. "That old man is Nana." A chief Cain continued, his eyes glittering. "We don't just have a traitor Pike. We have the nest, and we're going to burn it to the ground." He looked down at Rebecca's small homestead, now nothing more than the perfect bait for his trap. "Ride back to the settlement," Cain ordered, his voice cold as iron. "Get every man with a rifle and a grudge. Tell them the Apache are gathering at the Mayfield place. Tell them she's their ally, and we're going to wipe them out tonight before they can raid us at dawn. Tell them it's time to end this once and for all." The peace that settled over Rebecca's homestead after the Apache's visit was as fragile and luminous as a desert sunrise. Roasting the venison they had brought, its rich aroma filling her small cabin, she felt a flicker of hope for the first time in weeks. She was not entirely alone. She had acted on her conscience, and in the strange, brutal calculus of the frontier, her act had been seen and honored. It was a fleeting warmth, a brief candle flame in a vast, encroaching darkness. The darkness fell an hour before midnight. The assault came without warning, not with a shout, but with the violent explosion of a rifle shot that splintered her cabin door. A second followed, shattering the window pane, the sound a final definitive end to her brief peace. Rebecca dropped to the floor, her heart seizing with icy terror. The homey scent of roasting meat was now a mockery. Outside, the night erupted in a cacophony of shouts, galloping hooves, and the continuous thunder of gunfire. They were forming a perimeter, their movements practiced and vicious. "Give it up, Mayfield," a voice boomed, thick with malice and whiskey. It was Pike Cain's lieutenant. "We know you're in there. Send out the savages, and we might let you live." She was trapped, a lone woman in a wooden box, the target of a dozen angry men. Her Winchester lay on the table, a useless stick against a mob. As despair began its cold crawl up her spine, a different sound cut through the chaos, a single piercing cry from the rocks to the east. It was an Apache war cry, not of attack, but of response. An instant later, a volley of arrows hissed out of the darkness, thudding into the ground and walls around the cabin. They were not aimed at her. They were aimed at the posse. Cain, Nana, and at least 10 other warriors had materialized from the landscape. They had not left. They had been watching, standing guard, anticipating Cain's treachery. The homestead had become a battlefield. Cain's men, caught by surprise, yelled in anger and confusion. The fight devolved into a chaotic skirmish. Bright flashes of rifle fire answered by the silent, deadly flight of arrows. Rebecca crawled to the shattered window, peering out at the maelstrom. And then she saw him, not among the posse but by the barn. It was Jedediah. He wasn't firing a rifle. He was frantically letting her mare and cows out of the corral, driving them away from the line of fire and into the safety of a dry arroyo. A wave of profound relief washed over Rebecca. His betrayal had been born of fear, but his fundamental decency had won. He had not sided with Cain's blind hatred. He had come to help. Jedediah's courage lit a fire in her. She was not a damsel to be rescued. This was her home, her fight. She grabbed the Winchester, her hands no longer shaking. She knew this land, its every dip and shadow. Crawling to a small back window facing the arroyo, she rested the heavy barrel on the sill. She didn't aim to kill. She aimed to disrupt. She fired the rifle, bucking hard. The bullet kicked up dirt near a man reloading, causing him to yelp and dive for cover. She fired again, splintering the stock of a rifle. Another man had rested on a fence post. Her shot sowed confusion, making the posse believe they were being flanked. It was the opening the Apache needed. At a sharp command from Nana, his warriors pressed their advantage, their movements a symphony of deadly grace. The tide of the battle turned. The posse, mostly drunken ranchers and hired guns, had come for a slaughter, not a disciplined fight. Their morale began to crumble. Silas Cain, however, was fueled by a fanatical hatred that bordered on madness. He saw his victory slipping away, and it enraged him. He roared at his men to hold their ground. Then through the smoke and chaos he saw Cain moving between boulders. This was Cain's chance. This was no longer about land or community. It was personal. Killing the chief's son would be the ultimate act of domination. With a bellow of pure rage, Cain broke cover, charging directly toward Cain's position, his pistol firing wildly. Cain, distracted by another attacker, turned too late. Cain was almost upon him, his face a contorted mask of fury, the pistol leveled at Cain's chest. From her window, Rebecca saw it all unfold. Time seemed to slow to a crawl. She saw Cain's eyes widen in realization. She saw the grim certainty of death on Cain's face. She couldn't reload in time. There was no time for anything. Except one thing. In a mirror of the act that had started it all, Rebecca burst from her cabin, running with a desperate speed she didn't know she possessed. She ran not towards safety, but into the very heart of the violence. No. She screamed the word torn from her throat. She reached the two men just as Cain's finger tightened on the trigger. Without hesitation, she threw herself forward, putting her own body squarely between the barrel of the gun and Cain's chest. It was not a hidden secret act this time. It was a public declaration witnessed by all, by the posse, by the warriors, by Jedediah, who watched in frozen horror from the barn. The battlefield fell silent. Cain, his finger on the trigger, stared at her in stunned disbelief. This woman, this insignificant, stubborn widow, had defied him again, shielding the savage with her own flesh and blood. "Get out of the way, you crazy witch!" He snarled, his mind unable to process the scene. Enough. Rebecca said, her voice shaking, but clear, amplified by the sudden shocked quiet. She wasn't looking at Cain. Her gaze swept over all of them, white and Apache alike. Enough killing. Look at us. Look at what this hate has done. It turns neighbors into murderers. It burns down homes. For what? For this dirt. There is enough land. There is not enough peace. Her words, simple and raw, hung in the night air. The sheer insane courage of her standing unarmed between two mortal enemies was more powerful than any weapon. The fighters on both sides lowered their guns and bows, their bloodlust draining away, replaced by a sense of awe and shame. The spell was broken. Cain's authority built on fear evaporated. He looked around and saw his own men, staring not at the Apache, but at him, their expressions a mixture of confusion and dawning disgust. In that moment of hesitation, Jedediah acted. He charged from the shadows of the barn, not with a gun, but with a heavy fence post. With a mighty heave, he swung it, catching Cain squarely in the back of the knees. The big man bellowed in pain and surprise and crashed to the ground, his pistol flying from his hand. The fight was over. The posse dissolved, its leader vanquished. Some men dropped their rifles and fled into the night. Others, like Jedediah, simply stood their ground, their faces grim, knowing a reckoning had come. Cain helped Rebecca to her feet, his touch gentle, his eyes full of a reverence that transcended words. The other warriors slowly emerged from the shadows, forming a silent, solemn circle around her. Then Nana, the old chief, stepped forward. He walked past the defeated form of Silas Cain and stopped directly in front of Rebecca. His ancient wise eyes searched her face and saw no hatred, only a fierce protective spirit. He began to speak in the Chiricahua dialect, his deep voice carrying across the scarred yard, his words directed to his people. When Nana had finished, he looked directly at Rebecca. Cain turned to her, his voice thick with emotion, as he translated. My father Nana says you have the spirit of the Creator. You did not fight with a weapon of iron, but with a weapon of the heart, which is the strongest shield. You stood for peace between our peoples, who have only known war. Our words for a person like you are old and sacred. Nana then placed a hand gently on her shoulder, a gesture of profound respect. He spoke two words clear and powerful in the night air. Ishki Bilki. Cain's voice trembled as he translated the ultimate honor. He calls you Mother of Peace. It is your name now among the people. It will not be forgotten. Rebecca looked from the old chief's face to Cain's, and then to the faces of the warriors who ringed her. She saw no trace of enmity, only a deep, soul-shaking respect. She glanced over at Jedediah, who simply nodded his eyes, shining with unshed tears. She had shielded a wounded warrior, and in a crucible of fire and blood, she had become a bridge. Her homestead, scarred and battered, was no longer a place of isolation. It was now neutral ground, a sanctuary consecrated by courage, where a fragile seed of peace had finally been planted. In the brutal, unforgiving heart of the Wild West, the story of Rebecca Mayfield, the woman they called Mother of Peace, serves as a powerful testament. It reminds us that courage isn't always found in the flash of a gunshot, but in the quiet, resolute strength of the human heart, and the willingness to stand for something greater than one's self-compassion. Her legacy is not written in history books, but it's etched into the soul of the land, a story of how one person's defiance of hatred can ripple outwards, creating a fragile but beautiful hope. If this story of incredible bravery and the fight for peace moved you, please honor Rebecca's legacy by hitting that like button. Share this video with others so her story can continue to inspire. And for more true tales of the forgotten heroes and untold dramas of the American West, be sure to subscribe to our channel. Thank you for listening.